Free lunch in primary schools, free education from pre-primary to the tertiary level, or amending the HUB Act to turn student loans into grants. The campaign trail hasn't been short of promises to improve learning in this country. In the same breath, the education system is not short of challenges. Well, the system is still recovering from the devastating effects of the COVID-19 pandemic while navigating the transition to CBC and trying to meet the infrastructure demands that come with it. Tonight on the COTER'S Hub, we interrogate the education promises on the campaign trail and the Azimio la Umoja One Kenya manifesto promise, waste not a single child. Joining me virtually is Dr. Evelyn Jepkemei, an education policy expert, as well as Dr. Emmanuel Manyasa from Usawa Agenda. Thank you both for joining me this evening. Emmanuel, let me begin with you. The promise to hire the over 300,000 unemployed teachers in this country was in the Azimio manifesto that was released earlier this week. What do you make of that promise, considering that the government is already recruiting about 5,000 teachers year on year and has set aside 2.5 billion shillings every single year for that? How feasible, how practical is that promise in your view?
Thank you, Vicky. First, I feel that maybe it is unfair for us to be discussing one manifesto before the second one is launched, so that we can discuss them side by side. But I still think that we will maybe consider that as being feasible only if it is progressive. It's not possible to hire the 300,000 in one go. It is possible to hire those teachers progressively over a short period of time. It is feasible because there is a lot of wastage of the resources that go to the Ministry of Education. And if we look inwards at the allocations and cut the waste and improve the efficiency and utilization of the money that goes to that ministry, we can actually create a reserve that we can use to increase the number of teachers. We may not be able to hire 300,000 in one go, but it is possible progressively to raise the number of teachers by improving efficiency in the utilization of funds in the ministry.
Emmanuel, you mentioned cutting the waste. What's contributing to this waste?
The waste in the ministry comes from what I would think is systemic failure and also partly policy failure. Systemic failure in the sense that if you look at the way the ministry is set up, there are a lot of functions, there are a lot of positions within the ministry and within Teacher Service Commission whose contribution to actual learning is minimal. And those positions cost the ministry resources, and they could be replaced by teachers. And that can be one way of cutting the waste. Also, the way we have structured even our capitation grants is such that we are not optimizing utilization of the capitation funds. Yeah. And we can be able to do better with that and save the ministry resources that will enable us to increase the number of teachers. If we decide that we want learning to be the core focus of the ministry and the core focus of all actors in the sector, I think we can actually do better than we are doing currently.
Evelyn, let me bring you in there. What do you make of the current teacher shortage and trying to meet or close that gap? I mean, right now, in terms of promises, what we have to work with is the Azimio manifesto. We can only refer to that, at least during this conversation. But what is actually needed to meet that demand of teachers?
Thank you very much, Vicky. I think that the demand for teachers is, the presence of teachers in the education system is one of those things that are what we would call critical factors. And so the fact that we have such a huge shortage of teachers in some ways is related to the kind of learning outcomes that we see. And so any effort to be able to close that gap that is created by, by the lack of teachers. I think we are lacking around 120,000 teachers. That shortage would go a long way in improving, the quality of education outcomes in this country. And it's one of those critical pillars of quality education is making sure that we have sufficient number of teachers.
No, certainly. Emmanuel, I've heard you talk about this in other forums, but of course, the rollout of the junior secondary school cohort and the challenges that come with that, what does the next administration, the next government have to take into account when this is happening and overall the transition into CBC?
First, we are in
Sorry, that was to Emmanuel, then we'll come to you, Evelyn.
Thank you. First, we are in a self-inflicted crisis. We shouldn't be facing this crisis right now if we had planned properly to implement CBC. We are here because we didn't plan to implement. We got into implementation almost by accident, or the same way you behave if someone pushed you into the swimming pool in your suit and a pair of shoes. So that is a self-inflicted crisis. However, the new government will have to grapple with this. And to me, three things can be done quickly. One is to focus on getting enough teachers who can teach these learners prepared to teach. That must be focused on. Second is to deploy those teachers in the smaller schools, in our sub-county schools. Because in a lot of our smaller schools, there is some space in those schools. They're not congested because they haven't been doing well, and so a lot of parents have struggled to make sure their children don't go there. So there is some space in our sub-county schools. We can create space by virtue of putting up tents in those schools and accommodate more learners come January, so that more of the CBC learners actually go to those schools come January. And then the third thing is to try and leverage technology. This country is largely covered by 3G internet in most parts. We can leverage technology to make sure that we put learners in learning centers, some of which may not necessarily be schools, and be able to use technology to teach those learners from schools and from other places from where teachers can operate comfortably. Because we are in a crisis, we need to accept that. The number of classrooms we have put up so far are far from what we need come January, and by January we will not have the classrooms we actually need.
Evelyn, when you hear what Emmanuel is saying, we kind of shot ourselves in the foot by not preparing adequately for this transition. Infrastructure is an issue, teachers is an issue. What would, for instance, in the first 100 days, the next administration needs to do to ensure that this is a more seamless transition when we're talking about CBC?
I think that the next government needs to consider what resources are actually available to support a smoother transition than we are currently seeing. Because when we say that the junior secondary is going to be domiciled in the current secondary schools, we know very well that those schools are, we do know that we have more primary schools than secondary schools, and it is not possible for us to be able to meet the demand at that time. So it's important that we map out the resources that we have and then make a decision on how we can actually transition this segment of education that we are calling junior secondary. We could decide that they continue staying in primary school to allow for us to build the necessary infrastructure in the secondary schools, if that is where we eventually want the junior secondary to go. But I think at the point where we are at, it's not very clear, and we certainly know that we don't have sufficient resources, even for the 60,000 classrooms that the ministry has promised to build, it is not going to be sufficient. And if we build the classrooms, where will the kids be accommodated? Because it is not possible for every child to go to a secondary school and walk back home. That is a good dream, but I think it is a dream that is for the future that we need to plan for. So I feel that it's important for the next government to conceptualize and really understand what is on the ground, what is there that we can actually be able to leverage, and how do we go about leveraging, the resources that are available.
Right. We have about a minute to go. I just want to hear from you two in terms of your outlook for the next 5 years. That's, the next term for the next administration or next government coming in. What does that look like? Both of you have talked about streamlining different processes, embracing technology. But what do you see the education sector actually becoming in the next 5 years, in an ideal world, if you will? Let me start with you, Emmanuel.
I would want to see more equity in our education system, especially in our secondary school subsector. There is massive inequity there, which then spill into our society, because the secondary school is very critical in our education sector. I would like to see universities playing the leadership role that they're supposed to play in the education sector. Currently, they are not, and I would like to see universities play that leadership role, the pool that they are supposed to be, to encourage children in lower levels to stay in school and to aspire to go to university. I want to see that. And finally, I want to see a more efficient education sector where we have policies that are working in sync. We have so many policies that oppose each other.
Okay, we seem to have lost Emmanuel. Evelyn, let me come to you to get your final thoughts on your outlook for the education sector.
Yeah, I think number one, I would like to see an education system that is reliant on robust research, that is evidence. I would like to see pedagogies and ways of teaching that are more innovative and revamped. But I would also like to see an education system that is flexible enough to be able to have plug-in points for innovations as they come along. It takes us a little bit too long to make changes, and yet we are living in an environment that is very dynamic. So we need a system that is flexible enough to be able to adopt new innovations very quickly and be able to put them in place. And of course, I agree with Emmanuel in what he has said about the universities taking the lead and teachers that are well prepared and policies that are sober and that are really grounded in evidence.
Thank you so much, Evelyn and Emmanuel, for your time and your insights into what is ailing the education sector and what needs to be done in terms of remedies from the next government coming in come August 9th. Let's take a short break here on Citizen Weekend. Much more ahead, including...
Viruses are not friends to the bacteria, but they are our friends in terms of clearing this bacterial infection.
Combating antibiotic resistance. The Khemri scientists engaged in research on viruses